I live in a haunted house and have done for around 7 years. The house was 2 stories, the ground level, then the basement level of equal size. In the basement, we had mine and my brother's room, as well as the furnace room and the living room. It started simple. When you would be downstairs, you would hear people running up and down the stairs and walking on the wood floors, and vice versa. After a while in my room and the furnace room, there began to be these tiny black creatures, around 2 feet tall with wide eyes and white teeth, that would move things and play with my toys. In the furnace room, they would rearrange the stacked junk. We used it as a garage, as we couldn't even walk into it very far. If that wasn't bad enough, we began seeing tall human shadow-like figures in a pitch-black room where you can't see your hand in front of your face, but you could see a shadow figure. They started showing up in the yard and trees and didn't really come into the house. Eventually our lives took a turn for the worse, with legal issues regarding my great-grandfather, and he came to live with us. He was never a good man. He beat his wife and kids and stole from everyone he could, but we took care of him all the same. He had his own demon that followed him. But anyway, when he showed up, he slept in the basement living room and regularly prayed for God to kill us because he believed that we were bad people. When he showed up, the shadow figures followed him into the house. They began standing in my doorway at night and watching me, so I would close and lock my door. Unlike the small imp creatures, the shadow people gave off a harmful vibe. Pretty soon, the shadow figure began coming into my room, as well as my brother's room, being their favorite. They never went upstairs or crossed my room doorway. I think it was my cat. However, they did love my brother's room, and they would stand at the end of his bed and watch him sleep. One night, things got much worse than they ever had. My great-grandfather was asleep in his bed, and I decided to put saran wrap over my brother's door to play a trick on him. I spent a bit of time taping up, and when I went to look at my handiwork, there were 3 huge cuts down the middle. So I took it down and tried again, and there they were once more. I decided to give it one more shot, and as I wrapped it up, it began tearing in front of me. And I mean really slowly, like someone was purposefully cutting into it. I decided to wake my brother and show him, and as he walked out of his room, we turned the corner and stood face to face with one of the shadow figures. It was standing in the room with all the lights around it, just turned around to look at us. They had no eyes or face, but you could still feel them looking at you. So we ran into my brother's room to hide. We lay there for a good long while we could hear the other room being thrown around. After a few hours we drifted off and slept through the night. After that, the shadow figures messed with my brother quite often. I believe it was because when we turned the corner, he was in front, and he was the one the shadow figures looked at. They began to physically attack him. My brother had a friend over, and my brother took a swing at one of the imps and it disappeared. But when they woke up, they had bruises all up and down their backs. As things got worse, the shadow figures wouldn't let us out of our rooms, and one night, when my brother left his room, one grabbed him and told him to get the hell back in bed, which my brother promptly did. A while after, my brother went to India with my dad on a business trip, whilst we still lived in that haunted house. Whilst there, my brother went into one of the old temples with the door low that forces you to bow to all the gods carved into it. He ended up buying these glass bracelets for my mother and sister at the temple. Nothing happened until he got home though. My brother and dad came home from India, and about a week went by and just the usual stuff happened. However, I started to see a small cat run up and down the stairs. Now, in a house with 3 cats, that wasn't unusual, except that this cat had no body. From what I could see of the cat was a spinal column and a head, and it all appeared to be made of smoke. Seeing what I'd seen in that house, I didn't think anything of it. Over time though, the cat got aggressive. I couldn't leave my bedroom after a while, and I don't mean that the cat sat outside and wouldn't let me out. When I would go to leave, I would become extremely heavy and tired, and as soon as I left my room, I'd hardly be able to move at all. This only happened at night, so I just passed it off as being too tired to make it past the bathroom. I dropped that theory when my brother began to tell me that the cat would sit on his chest at night and look at him. He said, whilst it was on him, he couldn't move or make a sound at all. I still believe that these things left him alone because of my cat. Once I rescued him, they never came back into the room as long as he was there. We ended up taking the bracelets my brother bought whilst in India and breaking them all. After that, we never did see that cat again. But the shadow figures and the things that followed my great-grandfather were still in the house. My mother believed us when we told her that all these things were in the basement and that we'd experienced them a lot. She told me that so had she. My dad, however, didn't believe us at all. Not until we were moving and he experienced it firsthand. Like I said before, my grandfather was in no way a good man. He had done so many things to hurt people that it would take me a long time to just list all the things he did. When he came to stay with us, he was 92 years old, but still coherent. However, he couldn't move that well and couldn't reach for anything below his waist, so he had to change his pants, underwear and socks. He would regularly pray for us to be hurt and killed, so it wasn't too unusual to find him talking to himself. He was always afraid of the night though. This was around the time things with the shadow figures were getting bad, and my great-grandfather was telling us that he had this demon following him around, which we just wrote off as him going crazy. Eventually, we would find him laying on the ground outside the bathroom, saying things like, "It pushed me down," or "It's trying to get to me." We just figured the hell, and we took extra precautions to make sure he wouldn't again. We found him there a few more times, and we began to see scratches on his feet, starting at his ankles and running down to his toes, like something was grabbing him. It was odd, because he could never reach for his feet. This was when my dad started to become a little uneasy about the house. Now, we moved out very shortly after this, but due to recent robberies in the neighborhood, we had someone stay at the old house during the day, and one at night whilst we moved everything to the new house. My brother, who was 19 at the time, wanted to stay the night there alone, so my dad was there during the day. My dad said that all day he would hear people talking downstairs, and they would constantly sprint up and down. When he were downstairs, he'd hear them running back up the stairs. Despite that and what happened to my brother, he insisted on staying the night. He was going through a ghost hunting phase. My brother stayed 2 nights in the house, and I honestly could never get him to tell me what happened whilst he was there, but he told me that it was some of the scariest shit he'd ever experienced. He said he thought the shadow figures were angry that we were leaving, and that at night, the house went crazy. We still own the house, and I want to go back and stay the night, but honestly I'm afraid of what might happen. So, when we took in my great-grandfather, he also brought his cat, Angel. She seemed normal enough, and didn't do anything too unusual, just the normal creepy cat things. With her, we had 2 other cats. There was my brother's cat, Relish, and then my sister's cat, Whiskers. Relish slept in my brother's room, but when things started getting crazy, he would look up at the ceiling and howl all night, and eventually he would not come downstairs anymore, which was good because he peed on things. Whiskers slept upstairs or outside, so we never saw much of him. Angel was different though. The imp and shadow figures never bothered her or paid her any mind. She always just walked right by them around the basement at night without any fear. I had her in my room for a while, but the more she was in there, the more the things in the basement would come into my room, so I stopped letting her sleep with me. However, shortly after we rescued my cat, they left my room alone, as long as he was around. When a bit of time passed, Angel would spend all night in the furnace room, which is where the little imps would stay. I think it may have been because of the heat in the room. Either way, it became nearly impossible to keep her out of there. We never really paid her too much mind, except she would always sit across the room from my great-grandfather and watch him all day. After a while, my great-grandfather left and we had his cat that was tearing up the house, so we had to get rid of her. When we first got her, we drove her up from my great-grandfather's house, which is 5 hours away. She didn't make any noise, never seemed upset. She was always this way on car rides, such as to the vets or when we had to clean the house and take the pets out for the day. She never was bothered by the car. When we took her to give her away, however, she was different. She started just as quietly as normal, but once she got into the car, she began screaming at the top of her lungs. We thought she was just afraid of the car and kept going and going, and then she began shaking her crate so violently that the car shook. Once she began shaking, she stopped screaming and growled in the deepest, most threatening way I've ever heard. I've grown up with cats and know how they sound when they're scared or on the attack. But this was nothing like I've ever heard. My brother and I pulled over and were so terrified by this cat and not knowing what to do that we began to pray out loud. I didn't know what to say, so I just asked for protection. What was odd was the movement. I finished the prayer and Angel went quiet. The car stopped shaking and the cat wasn't making any more noise. The look in her eyes went from aggressive to the calm look it normally was. As we kept going, every time Angel began to shake and growl, I would recite the same prayer to myself and it would stop for a while. I'd like to think she was just frightened, but honestly I can't help but feel there was something wrong with her to this day. She never did seem right, but that was far from unusual. In conclusion, after moving away, we were a lot happier and everything was a lot calmer and tranquil. I hope for the next residents of the house, for their sakes, that whatever malicious entities still reside there get bored and leave.